Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary SanGiovanni, up to shenanigans once again of cosmic proportions. This episode and the next are going to be a little bit short, given that deadlines elsewhere are very tight. And next week is the second annual Scares That Care telethon. More on that at the end of the show. Today, we're going to talk about Clark Ashton Smith's The Return of the Sorcerer, one of his more popular cosmic horror tales. The story was first published in Strange Tales of Mystery and Terror in September 1931 and is considered part of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos due to references to the Necronomicon. There is also a vague reference to Lovecraft's pantheon as, quote, those who came before Satan, which is actually kind of a cool mixing of Judeo-Christian aspects of the devil with polytheistic belief in cosmic monster gods. Now, this story has Mr. Ogden. He's our narrator, and he's nearing the end of his savings and out of work. He accepts a job with Mr. John Carnby, a classic Lovecraftian scholarly recluse, looking for a secretary with extraordinarily intellectual skills, in particular, a knowledge of Arabic. Carnby is described as pale and possibly ill of health from overstudy, and we come to find that he has made a life study of demonism and sorcery. You kind of can't get much more Lovecraftian wizard than that, right? Although Carnby claims to be a non-believer and interested in these things only as an intellectual pursuit, over time Ogden perceives him as someone who, quote, was driven and obsessed by a real faith in all that he pretended to view with scientific detachment. Ogden, we find, is necessary for translating the original Arabic text of the Necronomicon to fill in whatever may be missing from the Latin versions of the text. So we have a situation a lot like several Lovecraft stories where we have somebody sort of stumbling upon arcane knowledge or eldritch knowledge, if you will, and we also have somebody who is working to improve that knowledge. Now, one of the things I thought was kind of cool is the way that Clark Ashton Smith describes an original Arabic copy of this book. He describes it as, quote, it was enormously old and was bound in ebony covers, arabesqued with silver and set with darkly glowing garnets. When I opened the yellowing pages, I drew back with involuntary revulsion at the odor which arose from them, an odor that was more than suggestive of physical decay, as if the book had lain among corpses in some forgotten graveyard and had taken on the taint of dissolution. Now, one of the things I think is interesting about this is that the Arabic copy, the original copy, I thought had been bound in human skin, unless I'm mistaken about that. But I thought that they had said that the original copy of the Necronomicon was bound in human skin and inked in blood. This is apparently a higher-end version of Arabic, but still one of the original, I guess, the original printings of this book. So I'm always fascinated to see how these ancient tomes are described, because I think it gives a sort of substance to what is otherwise kind of an intangible or ethereal linchpin in these kinds of stories. Now, we also have, this is clearly a story that tries to mimic Lovecraft's style. Okay, we have some of his mannerisms, some of Lovecraft's writing mannerisms, which are different than Smith's. He does use an antiquated style. He uses the semicolon and the and. I'm not sure when that changed, but having taught grammar for at least 3 years, I can tell you that technically you wouldn't have a semicolon and in current English written language. But it's interesting that Lovecraft did the same thing. It was one of those idiosyncrasies that stuck out to me. And Clark Ashton Smith does it in this story as well. He definitely tries to mimic Lovecraft's style of adjectives, but for Clark Ashton Smith, who does perfect purple prose like no writer I know, he's surprisingly restrained in his Lovecraft homage to the adjective. His lush, vivid prose is reduced to the occasional eldritch, the miasmic, the horror-hinting, in an attempt, I assume, at capturing a more Lovecraftian voice. And given the structure and plot, as I said, this story is clearly a nod to Lovecraft. But even so, we're still seeing the beginnings of mythos writers making cosmic horror their own. And I think that's important, that one of the things that is sort of neat about the Cthulhu mythos is its evolution. We've talked in past episodes about how originally Lovecraft's monsters and gods, they weren't evil, they weren't good, they were sort of indifferent, with maybe a leaning toward cruel or callous, but not evil per se. It was only with the evolution of the mythos in his circle of writers that followed him where we start to see delineations of good gods and bad gods, or bad gods and worse gods, if you want. And so it's interesting to see another little evolution here of the Lovecraftian horror tale. And there's more. There's more of that where Clark Ashton Smith is taking this and sort of making it just a step removed. He's adding just a little step of himself, a little injection of what makes Clark Ashton Smith his own guy. And that's important. I think any writer does that. If it's true that there's nothing new under the sun, it's only true in terms of the bare bones of something. I think every writer comes along and adds his or her own twist, his or her own personal essence that makes something unique, that makes something only available from that particular writer. You know, that writer makes it his or her own and does something a little bit different with it. Now, if we look at the narration in this particular story, it is Lovecraftian in its execution. It's pretty much straightforward. It's pretty much a Lovecraftian plot, more or less. The characterization is nominal, and that's in keeping with the idea of humanity's insignificance. Aside from who they are and what they do, all we really get in terms of emotion is the unimaginable depths of terror and loathing into which they're plunged. And we definitely get that from both the wizard, John Carnby, and from Ogden himself, who is really sort of terrified and dumbfounded by the things that he witnesses in this man's house. We can't really say that Ogden is any more a man of action than any of Lovecraft's characters. At first, he runs toward, rather than away from the sound of John Carnby's twin brother, Hellman, crashing into the room. But he attributes this not to any sign of bravery or any desire to help John, but rather to a force that he can't control, a force that sort of overpowers him and propels him from the room. He also notes that this particular force stops him at the door, so that he doesn't actually get inside the room until everything is finished. Now, it could be that this, any action he does, whether it's moving forward or standing still, whether it's compelling him to rush toward the thing that's happening or freezing him in his spot, he attributes this to other forces stronger than his own will, and one wonders what this force was and what Smith was doing with this exactly, because these forces may well simply be the measures that Hellman Carnby takes to keep from being interrupted in his singular purpose, okay, which is essentially to murder his twin brother in a fit of revenge. But they do seem somewhat counter to that sort of chaotic evil mindset. Why not just massacre Ogden too? Is it the nature of the spell that the body can only be, because without getting too deeply into the specifics of the plot, the body of a strong enough wizard can be reincarnated in order to achieve a certain purpose, at which point the body, whatever the force is that is reanimating the body, will then leave it. So I think we're left to the idea that if the wizard's will is strong enough to reincarnate this body for a single-minded purpose, it may not allow any side quests, despite however powerful this wizard may be. So maybe Ogden is only spared because the wizard simply can't act upon him in any meaningful way. Regardless of why this force causes Ogden to do what he does, we only see, and this is also something somewhat Lovecraftian, I think it's sort of reflective of the idea that the strongest fear is that of the unknown, that we can imagine as opposed to actually witnessing. We see the action in John Carnaby's room as shadows and silhouettes until literally the bodies hit the floor. Then we get a little of Clark Ashton Smith's magical description in the pile of mingled twins' body parts. And for anybody who believes that most cosmic horror is dry or too quiet to really get into any sense of gore or violence, I would suggest that perhaps you're not reading it closely enough, because Clark Ashton Smith's description of the bodies, the dismembered body parts in a pile on the floor, and what they look like and what they smell like, and the mingling of new body parts versus old body parts, as well as the weapons that were used to dismember these bodies, and just the description of the dismembered body parts in general, which were instrumental in causing another death. There's something very creepy about that. There's something very unsettling about that. I would say even to a person who's used to somewhat graphic and gory descriptions, and maybe it's because of the times, maybe it's just the way that Clark Ashton Smith describes them, but there's something very unsettling in a simple description of something that would otherwise almost be laughable by today's standards. A hand crawling across a floor, or a foot thumping down a hallway. But he manages to make it very eerie and very unsettling. One thing that I do find interesting about Ogden, the character, and again, as we said, we're not given a whole lot of depth of character here, but Ogden does choose morality over occult power by John's side. And at least we can get behind his reasons for taking the job in the first place, despite his gut-level misgivings. Here we have your basic guy who is just about broke and about to be homeless, and he takes a job where the guy says, here, you can have this room for free, and I will pay you basically to type up my notes. And he seems like a harmless old guy. You can understand why he... It's almost a more substantial reason than most characters who get involved in cosmic horror situations, particularly in Lovecraft's with Lovecraft's characters. A lot of cases of that, for as prone to these emotional fits of terror as so many of these characters are, they really don't think through or seem to have any gut instinct at all. Whereas Ogden kind of knows from the beginning that there's something off here. There's something. It's like when you go into the creepy old house and you know that this is that guy that your parents said you probably shouldn't be alone at the party with. You know, this is that guy, and Ogden sort of knows it, and yet he's in a desperate situation. And when it comes down to it, he still chooses the right thing over the thing that's ultimately going to destroy him. And maybe that's. I think that's an interesting deviation from a lot of these characters in cosmic horror stories, at least traditionally in cosmic horror stories, who get so deeply into the situations they're involved in that it's almost too late for them to pull themselves out. One other aspect that I think is worth noting in this story is that the spell that John Carnby uses to try to exorcise his twin brother, and by exorcise, I mean like demonic exorcism, not like jumping jacks and Jack LaLanne kind of stuff. The spell fails. Now, this is kind of... We're not told whether it failed because Hellman was a better wizard, a stronger wizard than his twin brother, or because John just wasn't that good at it. and somehow messed up the spell. Or even because Ogden's translation was somehow imperfect. And there is an indication that that may be possible. At least, well, actually, there are indications throughout the story that any one of those is possible, or maybe all three. But it would be the first time that I'm aware of that a spell from the Necronomicon failed. Usually the horror in most mythos stories arises from the opposite problem, which is that the spells don't fail. In fact, they so much don't fail that people accidentally reading things out loud cause these horrible things to happen. And I would, without getting again into too many specifics, I would venture to say that most people involved in magic would tell you that it's a lot more complicated than accidentally reading an incantation. But the point is that most of these cosmic horror situations are because the spells do not fail. Whereas in this one, the horror in this story comes about as a result of something that would have essentially been a blessing in the cases of the other users of the Necronomicon. So we have basically a short story which I think is an interesting homage to Lovecraft's work. It's The Return of the Sorcerer, right alongside there with other mythos stories about the summoning of evil entities from beyond space and time. And I think it's sort of an interesting thing to look at, even then, even in 1931, which is shortly following on the heels of anything that Lovecraft is doing, that we get, even then, a little bit of an evolution in cosmic horror and in the direction that it's going, which I think sets something of a trend. I think there is, although there is, as we've said before, a definite sense of hopelessness and insignificance for a lot of characters, it seems to me that more modern cosmic horror characters try to struggle beyond that, as opposed to just giving it up to insanity and madness and, oh my god, this mind-blowing truth. So that is The Return of the Sorcerer. One thing I want to note before I go is that we have some awesome ads for some awesome things that you can read in the meantime. For example, 17-year-old James Daly's father bought a house in small-town Eddington, Georgia, to go with a promotion at his Atlanta law firm, only to lose his job when the housing bubble popped. Now James has to work at the Best Buy to help pay their underwater mortgage. He can't wait until he turns 18 and can leave Eddington behind forever. But when a local boy challenges him to an ATV race near a tree farm most people avoid, things get much worse. James's rival is dismembered by a tentacled horror, I'm sold already, emerging from a nearby pond. The monstrosity has been worshipped by a murderous coven, sold once again, since before the Civil War, and its devotees don't take kindly to their secrets being threatened. Now, with the aid of a local girl he doesn't liking, and a renegade cult member, James must fight to avoid ending up bound to a picnic table and offered to a monster. He must do battle with both the cultists and their predatory master, the Thing in the Woods. Fantasy and horror writer James R. Tuck says to turn the lights on when you read this because it's a scary one. Cultural critic Danielle Sudis describes it as adolescent Southern Gothic by way of Clive Barker. Now that is a quote. Fans of H.P. Lovecraft and monster fiction in general will love this descent into the dark, wet woods of rural Georgia, where horrors from beyond have been sated with blood for centuries, and now emerge terrifying into the light of day. The Thing in the Woods by Matthew W. Quinn, Quinn, is available exclusively on Amazon as an ebook, as part of the Kindle Unlimited program, and in print from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online outlets. So check that one out. That one sounds really cool. That one sounds like something right up my alley. We also have Keyport Cthulhu by, wait for it, our very own Armand Rosamilia. It is the revised and expanded edition. The painting forced him to move back with such suddenness he nearly fell over the side of the old wooden railing. It depicted a grisly scene, as if your worst nightmare had been splattered on canvas. Despite his mind screaming to look away, he could not avert his eyes. That's from Ancient. Set in the New Jersey fishing village of Keyport, where the esoteric Order of Dagon has been planning for the awakening of the Deep One all these years, who can survive when Cthulhu rises? This also includes several bonus stories. The steampunk tale Rats in the Cellars. This is very Sutter Kane right here. Cthulhucorn, I hope I pronounced that correctly, co-written by Caitlin Rosamilia. Lockbox, which was previously unreleased, I guess, in the original edition of this. And 2 Lovecraftian tales from author Chuck Buda. The Terrible Old Man of Keyport, which delights me because The Terrible Old Man is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. And Dark Waters of Sin. So that is Keyport Cthulhu by Armand Rosamilia. You can get that at Amazon and Kindle Unlimited, as well as in print.
I'm going to break my vow of silence as the engineer. Only to say that I have read the original Keyport Cthulhu, and it's a very, very good book.
Is it? Is it? Because it sounds like a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun, and if you like Lovecraft, I highly recommend checking this collection out. I have not read the revised edition, but the original was great. So
nice. So basically,
I will go back to being quiet now.
We looked out with two awesome sounding books. So check that out. That's Keyport Cthulhu by Armand Rosamilia, and The Thing in the Woods by Matthew W. Quinn. Now, one more thing before I go. As I mentioned earlier in the show, this show and the next one are probably going to be a little bit short because we have the Scares That Care second annual telethon coming up. By the time that you hear this, it will be the coming Friday. The Horror Show with Brian Keene is holding its second annual 24-hour live streaming telethon to raise money for Scares That Care, a 501c3 charity that helps children with cancer, women with breast cancer, and burn victims. Scares That Care is a completely volunteer organization. None of the staff and no one on the board of directors draws a salary. The money goes directly to the families in need. Our goal for this year's telethon is $20,000 in 24 hours. And I really, really hope that you'll consider taking a listen to it. It's from Friday, May 11th at noon until Saturday, May 12th at noon. And even if you can't listen, that you will consider donating some money. This is a great charity, and it does a lot of good for people who really need it. So that's the 2018 Horror Show with Brian Keene telethon. It begins at, as I said, noon on May 11th and ends at noon on May 12th. That's Eastern Standard Time. It will be live streamed for free across the world via the Project Entertainment Network's YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and you look for the Project Entertainment Network, that's where it's going to be streamed live. Okay? Again, I want to thank Dave Thomas, who is an awesome engineer and is handling the show today. If you want to show your appreciation, check out his Meteor Notes channel on Twitch. It's Twitch/Meteor Notes?
It's twitch.tv/Meteor Notes.
Twitch.tv/Meteor Notes. You can also listen to The Horror Show with Brian Keene, where Dave and I and Brian talk about pretty much everything related to horror. You can find that, as with Cosmic Shenanigans and other projects, other interesting podcasts that people do, on the Project Entertainment Network, on Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, and all other platforms. And if you would consider it, the best thing you can do for any of these podcasts that you support is to go to iTunes and leave 5 stars. You can say anything you want to. You can basically say these people are a bunch of chuckleheads. But if you leave 5 stars, that benefits the podcast in that it helps us with advertising and basically just makes us feel good. So if you would like to advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans and have Dave and I talk about how awesome your book is, send an email to Armand Rosamilia at armandrosamilia@gmail.com. That's ARMANDROSAMILIA@gmail.com. I gave him a hard time that his name is so long, and then he pointed out that mine is Mary SanGiovanni, so I can't really give him a hard time about that anymore. But that's where you would send your questions, comments, worries, concerns, criticism, or praise to Armand for advertising with Cosmic Shenanigans. And that's it for this week. I'll see you next week. Bye.
What up, co-workers? It's Hard at Work, show where we talk about nerdy stuff we talk about at work to distract us from work, recorded at work. I'm Hard at Work, Matt.
I'm Hard at Work, Nick.
Our show comes on every Tuesday around 6 o'clock or so.
That sounds about right.
And what do we talk about?
We talk about the nerdy stuff. You know, we're talking video games, movies, TV shows.
How much insider knowledge we got?
0.
None at all.
We don't know shit.
How good are our opinions?
Oh, they're real good.
They real good, though. Trust me. So tune in, give it a listen. You'll love it.